Good morning. I appreciate people taking a little time. We appreciate people taking a little time out of your summer vacation and your summer break to get a report from the policy forum. Truly hot off the presses, released first thing this morning. Some may have been able to see a little bit of the media about this, but you'll get some more in-depth presentation today from the researchers who did this work. And we'll have some other information as well. As Heather just put into the chat, as we go through the presentations this morning, feel free to put any questions that may come up into the Q&A. We'll have some time at the end where we will try to make sure that we can address those. I'm just going to have a couple introductory remarks and turn it over to Rob Henkin to start today. To say that it's been an eventful year in K-12 education in Wisconsin and Milwaukee is an understatement, to say the least. I'm just going to outline for you a little context of what we have seen over the last year. The state budget passed in 2023 included significant increase in per pupil expenditures for students in Milwaukee charter schools and choice schools. That action narrowed significantly the gap, the funding gap that has existed over time between kids educated in the charter and the choice schools and in the Milwaukee public schools. And not long after that, in December, the Milwaukee Public Schools announced their intention to go to referendum for $252 million in the spring of 2024. Many of us weighed in on that issue and were involved in the discussion around that issue. It passed by the slimmest of margins in the first week in April. Just a month or so after that, revelations about overdue DPI reports, fundamental weaknesses in MPS fiscal mismanagement or management led to sanctions from the state, the federal government, and the abrupt departure of the superintendent and other high-ranking MPS officials. In June, Governor Tony Evers announced that the state would fund an operational and instructional review at the Milwaukee Public Schools. The consultant has now been selected for that operational review. We expect that the consultant for the instructional review will be announced before the fall starts. During all this time, a group of Milwaukee residents, parents upset by the current situation and by some of the response from the Milwaukee School Board, initiated a recall effort against 4 of the 7 existing school board members. The final day for collecting signatures on that recall is in this upcoming week, August 12th. So we'll hear more very soon about whether any of those recalls will proceed. Reform options are being formulated by lots of stakeholders. Legislatures poised to act when they return in January of 2025 after the fall elections. Oh, and by the way, we have new maps for legislative districts in the state of Wisconsin that'll be new this fall. Wherever you stand on those issues, there's likely to be a much smaller majority in the legislature, and about a quarter of the legislative members are expected to be brand new to the legislature. Lots happening and lots changing in the landscape in education in Wisconsin and most specifically in Milwaukee. With that backdrop, the policy forum has taken its first in-depth kind of longitudinal exploration into Milwaukee students and educational systems, the first time they've done this in about a decade. The forum does lots of great work annually on issues surrounding education, but this comprehensive effort is part of a series that will hopefully look to inform action and change in our school districts and schools moving forward. The forum's focus on this project is on 3 areas. 1, demographics and student population. 2, school funding and the financial status in all Milwaukee schools. And 3, student outcomes and school performance. When the forum is done with their presentation, they will be followed by Colleston Morgan of City Forward Collective. City Forward Collective conducted a poll in mid-July of Milwaukee voters regarding their opinions on many of these current educational matters. So Colleston will add a little bit to that discussion as well. And as I introduce the presenters to this report, I just want to read one paragraph. It's from page 48, and it drives home the urgency and the reason why so many of us are poised to act on what we believe to be the unacceptable status quo in the Milwaukee schools. This is the quote. The last 30 years may have seen many changes in schooling options and funding levels, but they have not seen educational outcomes fundamentally transform the city as a whole. Across school types, too many Milwaukee students are not able to demonstrate academic skills and knowledge at the level they need to in order to succeed beyond their school years. Milwaukee leaders thus must continue to contend with what it will take to increase growth and raise achievement for all students. And we have a number of Milwaukee leaders joining us today watching us and participating today. We're thrilled to have you. I'm also very thrilled to just introduce our partners today. And I start by introducing Rob Henkin, who has been a friend to the Greater Milwaukee Committee, a friend to Milwaukee for many years. He has now moved into his role as immediate past president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, one of our terrific partners. So I turn it over to you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Joel. Thanks to all of you for tuning in on this beautiful August Friday. My role is just to give you a few brief introductory remarks, set the stage, and then I'll be turning it over to Sarah Shaw, our Deputy Research Director and Senior Education Researcher, to walk you through the findings of the report. This, as Joel said, is the first in a series of two reports. Roll Call, the report released this morning, explores the landscape of K-12 schools in the city of Milwaukee. Our follow-up, which we hope to publish later this year, will consider the steps we might take as a community to improve school performance across that landscape. As Joel also mentioned, these reports follow a similar landscape analysis the forum published 10 years ago. They come more than 30 years after the Milwaukee School Choice Program was created in 1990 in non-sectarian private schools, and almost 30 years after the program was expanded to religious schools in 1995. Before introducing Sarah, I would like to touch briefly on what this report is and what it is not. It is an effort to simply lay out for policymakers, civic leaders, and citizens the characteristics of the de facto system of schools we have created in the city of Milwaukee, including, as Joel said, demographics, how these schools are financed, how they are performing. We also use extensive trend analysis to show how things have changed over time and how they have remained the same. Our primary lens is the landscape as a whole and not its individual sectors. This report decidedly is not an effort to compare and contrast the pluses and minuses of the three main sectors of schools in Milwaukee: public, independent, charter, and choice, though we do break down the data where possible to provide a more granular analysis of each. We recognize and acknowledge that such breakdowns generate some imperfection as well as some contention, but we would also contest vigorously that any effort to understand K-12 education in Milwaukee must include such analysis. Finally, I want to acknowledge our research team, which consisted primarily of Sarah, our president, Jason Stein, and a research fellow we hired for this project, Rob Rao. The opportunity to involve Rob came about through the generosity of the Northwestern Mutual Foundation, which was considering hiring Rob on its own to do education research when he retired after several years at the helm of Milwaukee College Prep. Foundation leaders thought to reach out to the forum to see if Rob might instead contribute to some of the work we were doing, and that came at a perfect time, and our desire to update our landscape research provided the perfect vehicle to bring on Rob as a research fellow. In addition to the Northwestern Mutual Foundation, we would like to thank the Greater Milwaukee Foundation for its generous support of our education research. And with that, I again want to thank the GMC for inviting us to present, and I will now turn the program over to the forum's Deputy Research Director and Senior Education Researcher, Sarah Shaw.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to get a screen share going for us so that we can be taking a look at some of our key findings all together in what was a very long report. So an executive summary is available for more digestible consumption, and we're hopeful to highlight many of the major findings for you here today. As Heather mentioned at the top, please feel free to be putting questions into the Q&A as we go along, and we'll look forward to going through them at the end of the webinar. So to pick up where Rob led us off, We last published a report on this topic back in 2014, and we start by looking at what is the landscape in terms of the options available to students, and find that those options are quite similar to what existed back in 2014. We have the traditional public schools in MPS. We have charter schools that exist both within MPS and outside of MPS. And we have private choice programs where state tuition vouchers follow children to private schools. We also have open enrollment, by which students who live in Milwaukee can attend a public school district outside of MPS. The two differences in this landscape review as compared to 2014 in terms of those options available, the first is that the Chapter 220 Integration Aid Program has been nearly fully phased out. So that is no longer a major player in the landscape. And there's been a new choice program introduced. So the Special Needs Scholarship Program allows students who have identified disabilities to use public funding to attend private schools. Besides these options, we also do still have small percentages of students who are homeschooled and percentages of students who attend private school without a voucher, which we characterize as private pay students. The breakdown of how these different sectors make up the full landscape is visualized here. You can see traditional MPS schools, so this is not including the MPS charters, or at least not those that are run independently, make up 54% of the students who are educated in Milwaukee as of 2023. Another quarter or so are in our choice programs, whether through the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program or those that serve children in the rest of Wisconsin or Racine or the Special Needs Scholarship Program. Then those two green sectors are both the independent charters and then those MPS charters that are run independently. Together, they serve another 15% of the students who are educated in Milwaukee schools. And then finally, we have just under 3% of students educated in Milwaukee who attend private school without those tuition vouchers, and another 1% who are homeschooled. Not shown here because they're not educated in Milwaukee, but we have just under another 6,000 students who use open enrollment to attend school outside of MPS. When we look at these trends over time of where students have been going to school, we see an overall decline in the youth population of Milwaukee, and that's represented in student enrollment as well. So a 27% decrease in the youth under 18 via the 2020 census as compared to 2000. The vast majority of that is hitting MPS. So this chart, if you're looking at the dark blue line, that steep decline is MPS excluding its non-instrumentality charters that lost a third of its enrollment from 2006 to 2024. At the same time, our private choice programs increased by about 90%, and the charter school enrollment almost over doubled, in fact. There was also a steep decline in the private pay student population. At the same time that this is happening, we also have some shifts in demographics. And in fact, by 2023, the three sectors have quite similar demographics in most categories. Over 90% students who are economically disadvantaged, over 90% students of color, over 75% students who are economically disadvantaged, and between 12 and 15% of students who are English learners. The one exception here is students with disabilities. So MPS serves a far higher percentage of students who are identified with disabilities. They're at about 20% of their student population. The charter schools are at 11%. That's compared to statewide about 14%. And then the private choice programs, we do not have conclusive data on. So our report points out what is reported in state data, but also where we know that there are kids who are not reported in those numbers. Even so, we anticipate that the numbers would not be as high as MPS's. We then turn our attention to financial trends. So there has been a net decrease in the total amount of funding coming into Milwaukee schools across sectors in the last 20 years. However, on a per student basis, we are now largely even with 2 years ago, adjusted for inflation. That is primarily due to two factors. First of all, we had the MPS 2020 referendum, which helped raise MPS revenues back up. And then the 2023-25 state budget, as Joel mentioned, raised the funding for the charter schools and for the private choice programs. So we are now level where previously had been lagging. Those lagging factors for the total amount declining really come from the declining enrollment and also lags in state funding relative to inflation. MPS is set to see its revenues increase again in 2025. as a result of its April 2024 referendum. Overall, we do find that financial challenges are still likely ahead, primarily thanks to that declining enrollment that appears poised to continue, which is going to stretch the available dollars across a large number of schools. And we can see that large number of schools in this next graph. We can see proliferation of schools in the early years that followed increase in publicly funded students in the city. But as enrollment has declined, that number of school buildings and schools has not declined proportionately. So that's increasing strain on the system, and unfortunately is not going to be an easy fix because it is not distributed evenly across the city. We have some schools that are over-enrolled at the same time that we have other schools that are under-enrolled. So that we point to as a factor that's going to be part of discussions in the future for the city. We also do look at what is on the horizon for 2025 and beyond, largely due to that 23-25 state budget and the recent MPS referendum. So the 23-25 state budget had brought the funding between sectors to be fairly closer than it had been in a number of years. That gap is set to widen in 2025 because of the 2024 NPS referendum. Milwaukee Public Schools beyond core funding does also receive more state and federal funding. That's in as a reflection of the high level of needs that it serves as a district. But some of that funding is dramatically underfunded. We point to special education in particular, which also affects the charter schools. They receive money from the same pot of money, and English learner funding too. Private choice schools typically have less access to that federal funding, although they do receive a share of funding from the public school district to equitably serve students. Then we turn to performance and outcomes. Prior to the pandemic, we saw some indication that the city was making positive movement, largely incrementally. But then the pandemic hit and we see a real loss in those gains. So the figure that you're seeing here is national data. As such, it does not include the private schools, nor does it include independent charter schools. What we're seeing here is MPS and MPS charters. And the movement is a gradual uptick prior to the pandemic, and then really falling straight back down to where we were in 2009. This graphic is also showing us the large gap between Milwaukee's outcomes and national outcomes. So those orange lines are the average of all cities in the US that have a population of 250,000 or larger. Some of that discrepancy is probably due to the relatively high levels of child poverty in Milwaukee. That's a big factor affecting how kids are arriving at school and what schools need to do to help overcome some of those challenges. At the same time, the gap between outcomes in Milwaukee versus other cities has widened over time, which may indicate that those other cities are making more progress than Milwaukee has. We also looked at report card ratings. These are more holistic indicators, although have their own imperfections. And this is something of a busy graph. So I'll first say the top line takeaway and then break it down. We're looking at the percentage of students who are in poorly rated schools, which are our dark blue bars. Those are 1- and 2-star schools. 3-star schools are in gray, and then 4- and 5-star schools or highly rated schools are the light blue. And overall, what we want to see are smaller dark blue bars and larger light blue bars. And both before and after the pandemic, the majority of Milwaukee students did not attend highly rated schools. There was some variation between sector, and that's what you're seeing in the graph here. So the charters are the top line. You can see from 2017 to 2019, their light blue bars are going up, their dark blue bars are going down. That's exactly what we want to see. Post-pandemic, however, they have faltered and have not been able to achieve those same level of ratings that they had in the past. And that's even with a change in DPI's report card rating system that makes those higher ratings more attainable. The private choice schools in the middle, also we're seeing progress in declining the percentage of students in low-rated schools, increasing the percentage in highly rated schools, and they have been able to remain steadier post-pandemic. NPS, it's harder to see because their changes are a little bit smaller, in part because they are such a large system. But they were seeing decreases in the number of students and percentage of students in 1- and 2-star schools, and have remained somewhat steady with the later post-pandemic years, although had drops in test participation, which make it difficult to draw conclusions about where their ratings are landing post-pandemic. Those averages do hide some really concerning discrepancies when it comes to breakdowns by race, by ethnicity, and by student ability and needs. So this graph is looking at particularly our Black students, our students who are economically disadvantaged, Hispanic, or with disabilities, to give us a cross-section here. And when we looked at these, in addition to some other groupings, we found that the student groups who are least likely to be enrolled in highly rated schools are students in NPS, particularly those who are educated in concentrated poverty and concentrated segregation. NPS students who are in non-selective schools, those schools that don't have any selective admissions processes. Our Black students across the city, it didn't matter which sector we were looking at. Black students were not performing at the level, or were not having access to the same level of quality instruction and education as their particularly white peers. Economically disadvantaged students and students with disabilities. We do make a note here that this graph seems to show at first that our Hispanic students really do have higher access to more highly rated schools than other student groups. That's encouraging. We do have other data pointing out that at least at the charter and particularly NPS schools, scores for Hispanic students have slipped, and where we were once on par with Hispanic student peers in other cities, that is less so the case now. When we get down to basics and thinking about, okay, what if I take a reading or a math exam as a 3rd through 8th grader, what do I look like? We have disparities that have really persisted and in fact grown wider post-pandemic. So this graph here does not include our private choice students because we don't have demographic information on their outcomes, but shows that we have Black students who are much more likely to score below basic than their Hispanic peers, and particularly than their white peers. And overall, the percentage of students who score below basic across the city, inclusive of the private choice schools, is very discouraging. We have about half in both math and reading who score below basic, which is the lowest of 4 performance levels on these tests that are administered by DPI. This is going to be the last graph with a lot of data on it. So what we've looked at so far is all outcomes data when we're talking about student and school performance. One pretty important prerequisite to benefiting from school is being in school. And we have seen chronic absenteeism spike. So following the pandemic, 2021, you can see an increase that really goes up even further in 2022, and only somewhat is coming down in 23. Chronic absenteeism is referring to students who miss at least 10% of school days, whether excused or unexcused, and it amounts to at least 18 days in a school year, which can compound when a student is missing and then has to come back and try to get caught up, and can be very disruptive to classroom environments. So in 2023, Milwaukee charter students were missing 37%. We had, 37% of Milwaukee charter students were chronically absent, and 51% of NPS students, so over half. That's higher than the average for the poorest districts in America, which was 32%. So really a point of concern for the city, and potentially a place where we could see some real concerted action to try to bring these numbers back down. That leads me to the final slide before I pass it off, around where we landed with this report. As Rob mentioned, this one was really descriptive of trying to understand what do we see in the landscape, what are the forces at play here, and hopefully can tee up a next report that allows for thinking constructively about paths forward. So one of our very first takeaways here is that we do have more options for families, particularly for low-income families of color, in selecting their school. Outcomes for children have not transformed nearly as much, and in many ways reflect what we've seen in the past of very consistently low scores and very concerning gaps in outcomes for children. We have had improved transparency in a lot of our data sets. That's been great, but there are some key pieces still missing that made it difficult for us to draw firmer conclusions around some pieces. For example, as open enrollment has really grown as a program, it's now the fourth most popular form of schooling in Milwaukee. We don't have demographic information to tell us anything about who those kids are and who's benefiting from that program. You heard me mention a couple of places where we don't have demographic information on our private choice program students, which makes it difficult to talk again about who served and with what outcomes. And one big missing piece was student mobility, thinking about the rate at which students switch between schools, which can impact funding, can impact achievement, and is generally a missing piece in being able to understand when we're talking about a school, who are we even talking about? We did find some areas of shared concern across the sectors that we think offer some opportunities for citywide strategizing. I mentioned chronic absenteeism already as a big one, that underfunding of special education and English learner aid. And then the educator pipeline was not one that we touched on much in the report itself, but emerged in conversations, particularly with an advisory committee that we convened to help provide input on this report. And our future report that we've mentioned a couple times now will delve more into that, in addition to other promising practices and innovations, both within the city and nationally. So I will close us out there. I'm going to turn it over to Colleston in just a moment, and we'll take the opportunity to thank him and 9 other individuals who were so generous with their time. This was a labor of love report that required us to be in close conversation with many different perspectives around the city and in education. And this advisory group, which had representation from all of the school sectors, from academia, and a number of other aspects of this work, really came to the table to help inform our work. So thank you to them, thank you to Colleston, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Joel and Jim T, for having me. I'm excited to share a little bit of some of our research findings, but first, before I dig into that, I just want to echo gratitude to the policy forum for what I think is a really important contribution to our collective understanding about the work that has happened, and probably as importantly, the work that lays ahead for all of us improving outcomes for students across the city. I have just a couple of slides, and hopefully not as long, because I'm really eager to get to some of the questions, but would love to share a little bit of the work that we at City Forward Collective have been doing this summer. This particular round of parent and community engagement focused primarily on the situation and circumstances at Milwaukee Public Schools, just given the number of headlines that the district had made over the last month. But in framing this up, I do want to, sort of double underscore one of what I took away as the key messages, not just from the report, but from the conversations that we had as an advisory committee, which is that across the board, be it at the district, be it at our charter or our private schools, there's much work left to be done to ensure that all of our students have access to high quality, high performing school choices. If we can pull up the slides, thank you. For our part here, we went out into the field for a survey in mid-July. So this was, it feels like eons ago in political time, given all the intervening events, but this would have been immediately prior to the RNC. And so prior to all the subsequent events, we surveyed likely City of Milwaukee voters. We can go forward one slide here. Likely City of Milwaukee voters using both phone and web surveys, a total of 341 respondents that were demographically representative of the city's population. We really want to understand where were voter sentiments on matters related to MPS, both the ongoing sort of financial and operational issues at the district, the longer standing and in some ways even more urgent issue of improving student outcomes for the students who are attending schools operated by the district, and how that fits into the broader citywide picture. We had 5 key sets of findings in our report. If we can get forward one more slide again. The first, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the manner in which the district's issues had dominated the headlines up until that point, is that we found dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs at MPS. We found more than 3/4 of respondents, 78%, rated MPS's performance at a C or lower. Perhaps more concerningly, fewer than 1 in 5, just 18%, believe that things were improving at the district. When we asked, who do you trust on K-12 issues, who do you trust to address the challenges facing MPS and more broadly facing students across Milwaukee, we found strong levels of trust in the governor and the mayor in particular, top elected leaders, and a real desire to see them engage on these issues. There is an ongoing grassroots-led effort to recall some MPS school board members. We wanted to understand if there was deeper support for that recall effort. We did find substantial support for it. About 2/3 of our respondents indicated that they thought recalls were appropriate and were supportive of the effort. Just about 16% indicated opposition to the recalls. We also asked, this was sort of after the initial flurry of activity, do you have confidence in the steps that the school board has taken to date to respond to the financial and operational crisis, including the removal of the superintendent, the overhaul in the finance office? I think this was at this point they had appointed the interim financial manager, but had not yet appointed an interim superintendent. We found about an even split. About 49% lacked confidence in the response, and about 42% indicated some degree of confidence. Consistent with findings, more broadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a lot of concern about the impact on families' pocketbooks of the MPS financial issues. We wanted to see where were voter sentiments at on the MPS referendum. It narrowly passed, as we all recall, in April. And we found about 6 in 10 voters would oppose that referendum if we're back on the ballot today. As the district is working through the aftermath of the financial revelations and both the withheld state funds and the recalculation of funding in prior years, we found very low levels of support, just 4%, supporting additional tax increases to recover those lost funds. We offered a variety of other options, and one of our more surprising findings was that a slim majority, but a majority of 51%, indicated some support for closures and consolidations at under-enrolled schools as one measure that could be taken to address these financial situations. And as the policy forum report lifted up, we are not alone in Milwaukee, but we are one of many cities that has seen a significant decline in our total enrollment and project to see future enrollment declines as well. Finally, there's been a lot of conversation about the school board structure and governance reform and what steps might be appropriate in that regard. We did find significant demand for structural reforms at the district, but not a full takeover. Just 19% indicated that the current structure of the school board, 9 elected members, they wanted to see no changes to that structure. An overwhelming majority, nearly 80%, supported moving elections that are currently held in the spring to the fall. This would increase turnout and participation in those elections. About half of our respondents, again, 51%, supported adding appointed members alongside elected members. However, when we asked about either a full mayoral takeover or a fully appointed board, we found much stronger levels of opposition to that. 70% opposed a full mayoral takeover. I believe it was 63% or 62%, excuse me, opposed a fully appointed school board. I'll just take a moment here on this last finding to say one of the things that was notable to us is that all of the structural reforms that we found majority support for, we can also find in the political science and policy research literature support for these as steps that improve both sort of small d democratic accountability to the population, and in some cases have some correlation to improved academic outcomes as well. In urban settings. So, we see a very pragmatic electorate that is frustrated, but is also looking to make changes that are meaningful in terms of how the district is governed to address that component of our broader citywide performance challenges. I will pause there, and I know we've got some time for Q&A. I see some questions already popping up, so I think I might be handing this back off to Joel. But thank you for letting me hop in here just to share a little bit of our findings, and thank you again to the policy forum for what I know was hours of work to pull together and herd cats amongst their advisory committee as well in pulling together their report.
Thanks, Colleston. And there are a few questions that have come in, and people are welcome to put a few more in. I'm going to lead off with one, and I would ask both Colleston and any of the representatives from the forum to respond to this. Colleston, one of the responses was clearly against mayoral takeover, and there's lots of suggestions or discussion now around just around management of the district and how we do that, the governance issue. One, I mean, was that surprising to you at all, or surprising to anybody on that? And then two, as we move forward on that issue, any sense, again, it looks like it's a 50-50 proposition, and even in terms of like a hybrid, that's likely to be something that gets discussed. But just a little more context for that, or any surprise of what people thought on that issue?
Yeah, I was modestly surprised by the degree of opposition. You know, it sort of taken all together. You know, we've pulled this question before, and we had found sort of slim majorities or pluralities that were supportive of a variety of reforms, that we couldn't find any strong consensus for anything. Our last time being on the field on this was maybe 18 or 20 or so months ago. So it's been a bit of time, and of course, lots of intervening events. You know, I know there's been lots of conversation. The mayor in particular has, had things to say both about takeovers and more broadly about willingness to engage in between options. And, it seems to be the case that that's where the population's at. I kind of noted it in my initial presentation. I was most surprised by the degree to which what voters were interested in lined up, in fact, with what the research might suggest would be, smarter approaches, from a standpoint of improving student outcomes.
Great. Sarah, did you want to weigh in on that?
Just a short comment. This is not something that the management and governance question was not one from the report, but from the hours that we got to spend listening to school board meetings that did inform the report. I think there is just a really palpable lack of trust right now in the current way by which we're educating children, and the idea that some of what we might be seeing in poll results reflects how do people think we rebuild trust, stands out to me as a theme.
If I could add my 2 cents for just a sec, Joel. Just very briefly, when, first of all, the forum 12 years ago or so did a pretty extensive look at mayoral control, and at that point in time found sort of the results inconclusive in terms of whether it makes a difference in terms of improving school performance. But I think there are 2 issues here. Number one, in terms of mayoral control, some are in favor of that just as a means of accountability, of ensuring that there is a single elected official who is accountable for results. And we as researchers can't really comment on that one. But I think the other very important factor is a feeling that part of the problem we saw with this immediate crisis with MPS was a lack of expertise among school board members on financial issues, which again is subjective and political in some respects. But I just wanted to point out that there are other ways to skin that cat. So whether or not you're in favor of some big change in governance, there are other things being looked at to try to address that issue that would potentially include things like establishing an audit committee, putting more power in the Office of School Accountability that currently reports to the school board, and doing other things. So that's just the point I wanted to add.
A question for the policy forum team, and I think it puts together a couple of questions that we've gotten from some of the audience here. One, as I see it, and I think you have said, this is kind of a baseline, looking at where things are now, versus where they have been. The next level of your research is going to be around what works, both what works here, what has worked elsewhere. So there were a couple of questions, kind of what have we seen in other cities that urban education that works better? And maybe that's like to be determined, but you may have some input on that now. And then there was a question as to how long will that level of research take, and when will we see the next report?
Sure. So I'll invite Rob Rao to join me as well. He's been spending a lot of time looking at these other cities and getting to learn from them. To the question around the release, first of all, we are aiming for this fall. We'd like this to be a timely follow-up to help to be able to harness some of the current civic attention and mobilization here. Thinking in broad themes around some of the strategies we're looking at or asking about, really tied to performance, first of all. What is it that is where there are also challenging circumstances for educating children? What makes a difference? And some of them may not surprise our listeners, that they can come down to how we support our educators. They can come down to the expectations we have for our children, how we support both of those. But the details of that we're getting to flesh out right now in those, not only looking at quantitative data of where do we see other places seeing more progress, but also qualitative data via interviews and key informant conversations with people who are doing this work elsewhere. Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
We're not hearing anything from Rob, so maybe he doesn't want to, you've said it all. Another question for the forum members, that part of what you talked about, that there's lots more transparency, but still some data that's inaccessible or harder to get, and you have some suggestion about those. Any more specific, here's how, various sectors, like we might be able to get some better holistic information, and maybe even who's against that, or what would be the barriers to us being able to do that and get that wider view of what's truly going on and be able to compare all across those sectors?
Yeah, so I can speak to maybe starting with the private choice programs, and where we did have some missing data that would have been helpful in more fully expressing the picture we were hoping to. And that's from the perspective as a researcher, which is not the same as the perspective of a policy leader or a school leader who's responsible for pulling all of those data together. One small thing that made a big difference is the lack of having those students who participate in the special needs scholarship program. They are not currently reported on the choice report cards. Which means both that when the private schools want to point to what their numbers are of how many students with disabilities are they serving, they don't have a standardized data set that they can point to. And it means that we don't have visibility into this group of students who are receiving public funds, and therefore we would expect to be able to learn more about who they are and how they're performing. So that is potentially a win-win, but it does come with more onus on the private schools for this reporting. And the same goes for that demographic information. Our private schools, when we think of the three sectors, are historically those that receive the least government oversight because they're private. And we get into this murky gray area when private schools are receiving public funds around what, therefore, the responsibilities and trade-offs are of receiving public funds and also providing public data.
Hey, Joe, if I could I offer a perspective on that as well? Because this was one area where I think those of us who were on the advisory committee actually found pretty strong alignment amongst ourselves across various lines of difference. Lots of times the conversation is private schools aren't serving these kids, or public schools are serving more of these kids, and I think I wouldn't disagree with any of the characterizations that the policy forum put forward in their report. But I also think, private school teacher demographics is another one that came up quite a bit, and understanding, a quarter of our students are being served in private school classrooms. Who are those teachers in those classrooms? How many of them share identity or lived experiences or backgrounds from Milwaukee, align with students' identities in other ways? These are things that we know from the research, and we can find broad consensus across the board that these are important things that we should be looking at. But we don't collect that information. I'd also be a bit remiss if I didn't say we are, even with these data holes, fortunate that in comparison to a lot of other peers around the country, we do have relatively more information, at least on academic performance amongst our private schools, to look at, because we've had private schools in the state report card system. Most of our schools in Milwaukee participate with most all of their students, if not all. And so we've got good data both currently and over at least the last 7 to 10 years to understand academic performance on the assessments and those data forms. So the ask for more here, is one, again, I think you can find a lot of support for, acknowledging that we want to do it in a way that's not challenging for schools and others to report on. But I also think it's worth noting that the richness of the report here is not one you'd see in lots of other places that have private school voucher programs or ESAs. because some of that data just doesn't exist in other places. It's something I'm reminded of often when I'm talking to peers doing work like ours in other cities.
Thank you. Another question that just arose was around chronic absenteeism, which I think, again, all of us can agree is something that is startling, dismaying. And the suggestion was in much the same way that United Way many years ago, helped lead an effort around ending teen pregnancy, to the extent, Milwaukee County with other partners has driven some of the efforts around ending chronic homelessness. Like, that seems to be an issue that we can galvanize on. And there was a question again, and this may be a different level of research, whether there's an example of another community maybe that has done this well, or even if we don't have that information yet, what is it that are there any prescriptions about what we can do and how we can come together around that specific issue to make some immediate strides in the short term?
Yes, so this has been getting a lot of national attention, which means Google is actually a pretty decent friend here in being able to ask chronic absenteeism and solutions and seeing where other places are taking this on and making some headway. Some of the themes that come up nationally around how to be resolving the issue really focus on that student home or the school home relationship. So schools that are doing really active outreach, or communities, wouldn't have to be an education-based agency, but doing that active outreach to homes, to families, and finding out what are the barriers to attending school, reminding and reinforcing the importance of being in school, and establishing the trust and the connection to say, I care about whether or not your kid is in school. When children feel like they are wanted and welcomed, when families feel like they are wanted and welcomed, that helps break down some of these barriers. It might not address all logistical issues, but it's often a precursor to being able to make some of these numbers start moving. So some of the schools that have seen really low rates there was a kindergarten classroom in California that was featured recently, where that kindergarten teacher was on the phone every day with families. And if a kid missed one day, she was reminding them, okay, we really want your student back so that they're not falling behind because you missed one day, but then the next day you might come back and you're catching up from the previous day, which then means you might have to catch up again from that day. And it can become a really quickly negatively reinforcing cycle. So this is one where we think there's a lot of opportunity for not only cross-sector within education, but between education and other social services, to be thinking about how to really holistically wrap up our kids and reinforce this message and these connections between school and home.
And I do think, Jason, you may want to say something, but I know you guys have spent time talking to other leaders in the public sector about this report. And I think one of you was telling me that the mayor was dismayed about this. And again, people can talk about the mayor's involvement in education in general, but the notion of having the mayor as a product of the public schools and others in trying to be inspiring more kids to get back into the schools and to stay there, that's a role that a lot of us in the community can play. But Jason, you wanted to weigh in as well.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. And I'm Jason Stein, the president of the forum. I've mostly been happy and content to let my colleagues do such a good job here talking about this. But I do think that chronic absenteeism is sort of exhibit A in looking at how the rest of the community can help the schools, because I think it is important that we as community members don't simply pass off the responsibility that we all have to our kids purely to the school system. So I think when you think about county officials, city officials, nonprofit leaders, there's a lot of room to collectively reestablish the norm that our kids will be in school learning what they need to learn there, and to recognize that without that basic prerequisite, we're never going to make the progress that we need and do the catch up that we need to get back to where we were pre-pandemic and start growing.
I'll add one other note here, just thinking about another example of a school district that realized there had been some counter messaging, that during COVID, the message was so clear that if you're sick, stay home. And now parents didn't feel equipped to make that distinction between, well, when is it a cold and it's fine versus when is it something more concerning and they should stay home. And so this school district actually put a nurse at the building entrance for its schools so that any parent could bring their kid to school, talk to the nurse right there, and have the nurse either say, yep, go home, like you should take the day off, or welcome. We're so glad you're here. Come on into school. So there's a health aspect here too in the recovery from the pandemic and thinking about what are the mindsets that we've encouraged that we might need to now mitigate somewhat. And I think that's true for mental health as well. Youth mental health has tanked. And that can be a reason for kids not to come to school. So thinking about this not just as an education issue, but really a holistic youth issue, I think is important.
And Sarah, just wanted to kind of move in on that a little bit. There was a question also that in healthcare, there's lots of effort around the social determinants of health, things that, that people come, that healthcare is affected by so many other things. And it's the same no matter where you are with, the demographics of kids and going to school in the city of Milwaukee, generally, the same depending, regardless of whether they're at a public, a charter or a choice school, the notion of what comes to the schoolhouse door with those kids before they ever get there. And like, is there, and again, this may be the next level of research as well, but it's a community imperative for us. What else can we be doing around those things? Or are there examples of other places that are in some ways starting to get at those things that we have not yet gotten to in Milwaukee?
I think that question of how much is within schools' locus control versus outside of it is one we will never get rid of, and that the answer is probably in all cases both. We know that teachers and quality of instruction makes a difference in students' lives, and so we have to think of education as one of those levers for change, and to expect schools to do all of the work of providing stability in housing, in employment for adults, in trusting and loving relationships, in health, is too much to put on our schools alone. So where we can identify some of those social determinants of health to say, this is a place where we can take some of the load off of the education sector and help either through collaboration, coordination, whatever it may be, lighten that load. I think that's very important and may even offer some opportunities for collaboration between agencies, between the city and the county, the school system and other agencies, et cetera. This is not a kind of a plug for mayoral control, but one thing that was really interesting in talking with DC, which has had strong mayoral control, is that one kind of unexpected benefit there was that the mayor is in charge of all of the city services and so can coordinate between them. So it's less about accountability so much as it is about being able to say, here's our common goal. And how are we working toward that? And you wouldn't need mayoral control to do that. It's just the idea of being able to set a North Star and get all boats rowing in that direction.
And just the one point I would very quickly add is I think one of the areas that has never been examined appropriately is the connection between the county-run social services system and Milwaukee Public Schools and other schools. And so among the other briefings we did was County Executive Crowley, and there was a lot of receptivity toward perhaps looking at building that connection, particularly on the issue of chronic absenteeism. I have personally seen examples. Pittsburgh and Allegheny County is a primary one where there are much deeper connections between county and city-run health and human services and public school districts, and that is certainly an area that we should explore further.
Thank you all. Colleston, I have one last question for you. As you're continuing to do polling and research in the community, is there, over time, do you expect that City Forward Collective is going to continue to kind of look at some of those issues that you studied in July, or is this something that you're going to continue to kind of take the pulse of the community on, or any plans on those?
Yeah, absolutely. Both in terms of, some of the polling and survey work that lets us get broader reach and as well as some direct engagement with parents and families, users of the system, sort of ground level, grassroots understanding as well. But we absolutely, one of the things that we just fundamentally believe is that it's important that the voices of those who are most proximate, the day-to-day, going into our school rooms and classrooms, in many cases, right, you find these are families where one student's in one type of school, another student's in another type of school. We know one of those data points that we wish we had more of was around student mobility, but students are moving around a lot. And, there are very few families in the city that are making a decision, I will only send my kid to school sector X or school type Y. And so we think it's really important that we understand what's driving those decisions, what are the conditions and factors that are informing how they're coming into the building, what they're going home to every night, and what are the roles that we can play, as, in understanding and in our advocacy arm as well, as advocates for the conditions that our students need to thrive, be that, early childhood before they first set foot in a school, be that, out of school time, after school, summer engagement, while they're in school campuses. You mentioned social determinants of health, of which education is one, and then ultimately thinking about what does it look like for them to be able to exit, the K-12 school system into, a life of thriving agency and productivity, be that a business career, be that some other choice that they might make in terms of post-secondary pursuits.
Terrific. I'm going to offer up, I don't know if I will close this in a moment, unless anybody amongst our panelists have any closing comments that they want to make. I don't see anybody's camera going on immediately, so that affords me the chance to close it up. And first, thanks to the representatives of the Policy Forum for both being here today, but also the tireless work that they have done in preparation for this, and all the community involvement with that as well. And also to Colleston City Forward Collective for being part of continuing to measure and inform the public on these things. And for those who tuned in with us today and people who are going to watch the tape of this, we appreciate that you, during a time when school is not in session for most, are still engaged in this discussion, because it is absolutely one of the foremost and most urgent issues for all of us to deal with. And we will do so immediately upon the return to school, and even before that. There's work going on right now. But please look for, and there will be opportunities to be engaged with the GMC members in efforts around this in the coming weeks. And we will continue to make sure that we're bringing these education issues around K-12 and really the whole education spectrum into the conversation in the coming months. So thanks everybody for participating today and for tuning in. Appreciate it.